So at the time in Perth, pre-settlement, there was elaborate networks of lakes and waterways that were extremely vital for the Noongar people. That was used for ceremony, for burial, for hunting, for everything that they used in their life. Once settlers came in, they saw how the Aboriginal people were using this land, but eventually they just filled in these lake systems. Even though they saw how vital they were and the life sources that they gave, they still built over them. As an Aboriginal person, I can't understand why this would happen, and I'm pretty sure the traditional people at the time were scratching their heads wondering the same thing. And where we look at ownership of the land, the way that the Europeans built on it and they covered these life sources, it was like they were stamping their authority onto the land of they own it. Whereas Aboriginal people never owned it, they belonged to it. And they would never change the landscape in any way because it's their life source. If they changed it, there would no longer be a life source for them. Perth and the surrounding suburbs, for the traditional custodians in the Noongar Nation, were actually taken off the Aboriginal people and granted to Europeans without Noongar consent. And when they started building and putting fences up, a lot of the Noongar people had no idea what that meant. What is a fence? Why is the fence here? Why have they put a fence over our walking tracks? Why have they put a fence through our burial lots? Why have they put fences through our living area where we have our meres? On top of taking away our vital life sources, where do we go from here? Where do we live? And during this time, the Noongar people were removed from their home, not just removed from the land. And once the 1905 Act was implemented, that gave the government complete control over whatever they wanted to do with the Aboriginal people. They removed and they took the children to the missions. They put on curfews where Aboriginal people weren't allowed in towns between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. They were only allowed to work seasonal work and for half the pay of what white people were. They made it impossible for them to look after a family and then told the parents they were incompetent to look after their children. So the children were taken to missions, and then at the missions they taught the children how to be white and how to be house servants and sent them out on weekends to work in different households. The households would then pay the government. The government basically owned the Aboriginal people as slaves. This happened from 1905 to 1967, and from 1967 onwards we are still seeing the trauma that has been happened and passed down from generation to generation. A lot of the Aboriginal people who went through this have a lot of different issues, and they have a lot of, in the missions where a lot of abuse happened, sexually, physically, and that has taken its toll on a lot of the Aboriginal people today. It was an entire generation of Aboriginal kids who grew up without parents, and that has had a massive effect on the Aboriginal community today. If the Aboriginal people were caught inside this restricted area without a permit, they would be locked up. The sentences varied depending on the judge, and they could be removed and taken out to work on a farm or a mission, depending on what the sentence was. This generational trauma that's been handed down is something that has been continued because it's been denied by colonists, the settlers. And until they acknowledge that, the trauma will always be there. and they can't move forward until it's been acknowledged and they can actually deal with it and move on. That plays a big part of the trauma that's still around today, and people have no idea about the history that's happened. It's been lived by one culture and denied by the other. When we travel through the suburbs and we see multiple suburbs just appear overnight, massive buildings are getting built, we don't see it as progress. We see it as going backwards. Our culture never changed. We wanted to stay the same. We wanted the earth to stay as it was so it could look after us. If we changed it, it was damaging. So in a European context, if you build something, it's called progress. When we look at progress, completely polar opposites when it comes to the two different cultures who are trying to live together in this shared space. This culture of building and progress is seen the site specific as completely different. When Aboriginal people talk about a sacred site, it is a place where ceremony has happened for thousands of years and it stays the same. We don't want to change it. It's a sacred site. Whereas in European culture, we see sacred sites a little bit differently. When we look at war memorials, it's a big built building to memorialise something that happened on the other side of the world. Nothing actually happened in that space. We don't understand why that is sacred. The mentality between the two different cultures, one culture has lived this history and it's been handed down from generation to generation. Another culture has completely dismissed this history, and they've been denied the opportunity to learn it. If we teach this history and people understand it, we start to fill the gap. And if the gap gets filled, then there is no more gap. And we can understand each other more and we can actually move on forward.